it's fine. It's not too hot. Today, actually, it became a bit chilly, but again, not too bad. Well, it's State College. I mean, nothing changes here ever. Oh. We only get rumors about changes in the world.
Well, are they planning to come back to normal life next semester?
Yes, the fall semester so far is planned as in-person normal semester. And moreover, most importantly, the football games are planned to go as if nothing happened. So so the most important part of Penn State is football, as you know. Yeah.
Okay. We are online on YouTube now.
Very good. Okay. Well, I see people connecting, disconnecting, doing a lot of operations. Hey, Janina. Окей. Вера, привет.
Здравствуйте, Маша.
Привет, привет.
Здравствуйте, Жозе. Юра, привет. I have a feeling that I can present in Russian. I'm not sure if everybody will understand, but substantial number of people.
Привет, Вера. Я получил письмо от сына Марка Латаша. Марка Шик. Извини.
Hello, John.
I sent it to you too. It was
Yes, I received it. Thank you.
Yes, very great message. Because was a different rumors about his state and so on. Now I'm pleased to know he's just getting older, as all of us.
Yes, just be a keeper to me, and I can communicate you with everybody.
Hi, John. Too nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you as well.
Okay, so we have what, 2 or 3 more minutes before we begin. Hello, Roger. Hi, Raul.
Hi, Roger.
Hello, how are you doing? If you decided to do conferences only in Russian, I would be willing to learn Russian just to hear you talk.
You mean swear words? Gregor.
Hi,
nice to see you, Gregor.
Nice to see you.
Well, people are still connecting, so let's give them another minute, maybe.
Mark, will you play guitar during your talk?
I didn't plan to, which would be, of course, very much more informative than the talk itself, I guess. Particularly if I sing the motor control song, which I think I did in public only once during Anatole's talk at one of the Progress of Motor Controls. The second order linear motor control song.
I remember that song and that guitar playing. I remember it well.
Yeah, right. Well, maybe I'll do it one more time for one of these days. All right. So before I begin, we've been getting with Luis several emails with questions from from participants for discussion during the planned discussion session. So I want to say that we will have the discussion session on Wednesday. So on Monday, Mindy will present her talk. And on Wednesday, we'll have a general discussion session, same time, same place, same link. Everybody to respond to. All right, so if you have questions, please send them to me. And again, you can send questions to specific people, or you can send questions in general that you simply want to be discussed. And I'll try to then distill something like a combination of questions that summarizes more or less interests of the audience. Okay, so the rules you know, you should keep your camera on and your microphone off unless you want to speak up. Now, if you don't want your face to show your face, it's of course your right, but it's much more fun to see your faces rather than black squares with names. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker, but I don't have to do that because you already know the speaker, because it's me. Okay, so I'm going to, without much introduction, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to try to begin. So I hope you can see my screen and you can see the first slide with the title. It's a very strange talk for me. It's a very unusual talk because I'm going to speak about difference copy, and there are many reasons why it is unusual. It's not really a motor control term, although it's being used in motor control theories, but it's much more used in the field of perception. But I've been trying to direct my some of my talks or some of my thinking to address one of the biggest plagues of the field of motor control, which is jargon. We use so many words and expressions and without defining them. And quite frequently, some words, different words mean the same thing. And sometimes same words mean different things. So it's confusing. I've been trying to, these are just a few examples now. Now, what's a motor command? Very frequently used without explaining what people mean. What's muscle tone? Joint stiffness, or before it was even leg stiffness or even whole body stiffness. Impedance is used extremely broadly without defining what people mean. Well, synergy, now I think we're in a little bit better shape than some time ago. So clarifying these terms to me is not just a matter of cleaning up the language, but it is also a stimulus to think in a certain way and to do studies in a certain way. Like, for example, with respect to joint stiffness, we wrote a review paper with Zatsorsky, nearly 30 years ago. And since that time, really, I think it clarified our understanding, both biomechanical and neurophysiological, what we mean under muscle stiffness, joint stiffness, and so forth, limb stiffness. Same with synergy, similar with muscle tone. And maybe a less obvious term is difference-copy. So I'm going to speak about difference-copy, but I will try to put this term into a certain level, in a certain framework with respect to motor control and kinesthetic perception, which follows many of the topics and concepts that have already been featured in this summer school. So you will hear about equilibrium point hypothesis and referent coordinates, what you learned from Anatole, and a little bit about hierarchical control, and a little bit about uncontrolled manifold, which we heard from Gregor, and a few other things. So let us begin. Oops. Yeah, I'm screen sharing. Good. Let us begin with a more or less accepted now notion that action affects perception, but probably the first person scientifically who addressed that option was von Helmholtz, a very famous physiologist, physicist, and kind of very universal scientist, who noticed a very interesting thing, that if you move your eye naturally, the image of the external world moves over the retina and you perceive your eye motion in the motionless world. If you move your eye by pressing on it with a finger, and you can run this experiment on yourself, just close one eye and press a little bit on the other eye. Once again, you displace the eye, the image of the external world moves over the retina, but now you interpret it as a perception of motion of external world. You have a feeling that the world, the objects move, not the eye moves. So that was a very qualitative, of course, observation. And then it was developed into the first scheme that's more specific by von Holst and Mittelstadt in the middle of the 19th century, who introduced the principle of reference and the concept of difference copy explicitly. So this picture illustrates what von Holst implied under the efferent copy. First of all, for him, the efferent command was the output of the alpha motor neurons, which he addressed as the motor command, and some people still do that. By the way, the word efferent and afferent are relatively unambiguous, only when we talk about relatively peripheral parts of our system for movement production and perception. If we go into the brain, then efferent and afferent becomes a little bit less obvious. Some people would consider the input into the basal ganglia as part of the efferent output from the cortex. But it's not obvious at all, because then there is the feedback from the basal ganglia back into the cortex. So shall we consider it as afferent then? So it's not really clear. Even such trivial things like the output of gamma motor neurons, it's usually considered efferent. These are efferents. But these are efferents that produce no mechanical effect. Rather, they produce a sensory effect. They change the sensory feedback into the central nervous system. So maybe the output of gamma motor neurons should be viewed not as motor neurons, but as sensory neurons. Well, neurons that operate the sensory part of the process. So anyway, in the von Holst picture, the output, which he called motor command to the muscle of alpha motor neurons, had a corollary discharge, using Sperry's term, which he called efference copy, which was used to predict changes in the efference signals from sensory, in particular length-sensitive sensory endings in the muscle. The two of them were compared, which is, by the way, a completely non-trivial thing. I have no idea how you subtract action potentials along alpha motor neuronal axons from action potentials along 1A or 2 efferents. This makes no sense to me, but nevertheless, according to von Helmholtz, the system somehow did that. So for him, the efferent signals from the muscle that were produced by action were viewed as only part of the efferent signal. He called it re-efference. And there are also changes in the signal from the muscle that are produced by changes in external world, in forces, for example, acting on the body. He called it exafference. So exafference was always expected to produce reflex activation of alpha motor neurons and lead to changes in percepts. Re-efference, in his opinion, was first compared to this efference copy, and then only the difference between the two produced reflex activation of alpha motor neurons and led to changes in percepts. That's at least the definition of terms is clear within this picture, although how they interact is not clear. What happens in this magic black box, which is labeled re-efference minus efferent copy, it's not clear at all. But nevertheless, about 10 years, a bit more ago, Anatol Feldman noticed a straightforward problem with this picture. Imagine that you relax your muscles in one position, then you make a movement and you relax your muscles in a new position, and you can do that. If you can do that, this means that the output of alpha motor neurons to all muscles is 0. The efference copy is 0, but you are at different postures which correspond to different muscle length. So length-sensitive receptors are supposed to produce different output in those two postures. So how come that these different outputs, compared to the same 0, do not lead to a reflex activation of alpha motor neurons? They should, because this difference between the two signals cannot be 0 in both postures. The efference copy is the same, the efferent signals are different, external forces did not change, so this is a re-efference by definition. There is a non-zero input into alpha motor neurons, and muscles should get activated and should move you basically back to the initial posture, and this doesn't happen. So it is a problem which is well taken. More recently, efference copies have been considered, the notion has been considered as an essential part of the direct internal models or predictors. So the idea of internal models, it has been already described a couple of times. So these are hypothetical structures in the brain that do computational operations with neurophysiological signals to either predict what will happen with the body given its current state and the current output to the muscles, or trying to, these are direct internal models, or trying to predict what kind of signals should be sent to produce a certain desired motion. These are inverse internal models. I looked, and this is described in much more detail in the review that I recently published. It's in the list of the recommended literature. How people describe them. So if you look at different papers, the efference copies related to signals from different parts of the cortex of the large hemispheres, the cerebellum, and the basal ganglia. Moreover, if you read more accurately, you'll discover that the efference copy was supposed to play an important role in behaviors of a whole bunch of animals, not only humans, and not only vertebrates, not only high-level creatures that have central nervous systems that are somewhat similar to the human ones, but also fish, tadpoles, and even insects, where the nervous system is quite dramatically different. So the fact, if the efference copy exists in all these creatures, it cannot be pinpointed to a specific structure in the brain, because some of these structures are missing or play completely different roles in these creatures. So what is this efference copy? And I think the first thing we have to do is to kind of take a step backwards and ask ourselves a question. A copy of what can it be? So efferent process has to be defined. So we have to start with the motor control part. So what kind of signals are being sent by the central nervous system downstream kind of to produce an action? And then we can ask a question whether copies of these signals make sense to be used in the perceptual process as efferent copy is. So first we have to claim that there are certain things that are not efferent processes. So certain variables that are not part of it. And I refer to Anatole's talk when he made it very clear that the brain cannot in principle prescribe peripheral mechanical variables and muscle activation patterns. So these variables cannot be prescribed just by the design of the system. With respect to mechanical variables, it was emphasized by Bernstein in his classical book of 1947, and translation was published last year. Muscle activation patterns, because of the reflex feedbacks, they depend on those mechanical variables. And if you cannot prescribe those mechanical variables, you cannot prescribe muscle activation patterns because you don't know what kind of reflex feedback will be in future. It can also cannot prescribe any variables computed from these ones. Like, for example, stiffness, damping, impedance. If you take EMGs, you cannot prescribe EMG of a muscle. This means you cannot prescribe EMG of a group of muscles. So overall, these variables kind of fail. Now, from here on, we will have to get back to the equilibrium point hypothesis. And I want to introduce it in a slightly different way to what Anatole did, as a suggestion of what the salient variables for the efferent process can possibly be. So let's start with a distinction, clear distinction between inanimate motion, a motion in inanimate nature, and motion in the biological world. In the inanimate nature, there are rules of classical physics. If you know the forces acting on an object and you know parameters of this object and its initial state, you can predict its motion. There is no ambiguity with that. That's classical physics. And in particular, stones do not roll uphill unless they're thrown by a biological object or by something. If you leave a tennis ball on the table, it will be there in the morning. You may be absolutely sure about that again, unless a low probability event happens like earthquake or a biological object went by the table and took the tennis ball. So we ignore those. What about biological movement? The movements are not as much driven by external forces. Of course, they're constrained by external forces, but they move under their own intentions and goal. For example, animals walk uphill, swim against the current, and fly against the wind, something that inanimate objects do not do. And if you leave a cat on the table, it will not be there in the morning, unlike the tennis ball. Very likely, again. We're talking about the likelihood of events. So what does it mean for the control of biological movement? It means that living systems behave qualitatively different from inanimate objects. They do not violate laws of classical physics, or we have no reason to suspect that they do. But they're constrained by those laws rather than being driven by them. So, for example, if you jump up, you would fall down like a stone because you're not immune to the law of gravity. However, you can jump up, and the stones cannot. So the question is, how do you do that? How do you jump up from a squatting position when you're just squatted? Forget about accumulation of energy if you use the elastics of your tendons. And you can do that. So we have to define a living system so that it makes sense and it can distinguish this very qualitative difference between the behavior of animate and inanimate objects. So this is a definition that I suggested some years ago, which, well, it's one of the definitions that exists in the literature. But I suggest that the living systems are systems that can create new laws of nature. I mean, it can be evolutionary process. This creation can take a long, long time. And then as a result, these laws, new laws of nature, are going to be common across individuals and across objects in those individuals, elements of their bodies. Or they can be specific for a particular person and they can be developed over lifetime. So they can do that. And what's a law of nature? It's relations among salient variables and involving new parameters. Like F equals ma, the Anatole is, I had mentioned this, Newton's law in his talk. So force is mass times acceleration. You can write it force is acceleration times mass. Nothing prevents you from doing that. However, if you change force, acceleration will change, not mass. So variables like force and acceleration are constrained by the laws. Mass is not constrained by the law. It is kind of immune to it. Okay. And the second part, that living systems can modify parameters to produce actions. If you imagine, for example, a spring which obeys Hooke's law, linear simple spring, delta F equals K multiplied by delta F, change in force, is minus K multiplied by delta X, change in dimension or deformation. If you can imagine that, can you imagine a spring that learned how to change its stiffness or its zero length? The spring would become alive because it would now start to generate its own behaviors which are not driven by forces from the environment. It could jump, it could hop around and do very strange, unusual things. So this is what's called parametric control, that you change parameters of salient laws of nature and variables emerge and change in the interaction with the environment and as dictated by these laws of nature. So forces and other variables that we typically measure in the periphery, they change following changes in parameters. Okay, so let's get to the equilibrium point hypothesis, which is, to me, the first example of a motor control hypothesis that follows the idea of parametric control, or, well, introduces the idea of parametric control. Well, first of all, we can congratulate it. It's 55 years old. It was introduced by Anatole in the mid-60s. And I put this very general statement that any theory is as good as its ability to account for the available data in a logical way and to predict new findings that cannot be predicted by competing theories. I believe that Anatole's equilibrium point hypothesis satisfied both these requirements, so it's a good theory. And I'm going to show maybe a couple of examples, but I'm also going to then generalize it for the field of perception and show you that it can predict, or its extension can predict perceptual phenomena that are equally unpredictable from other theories, or at least I don't know how to predict them. All right, so this is the law of nature that's common for all skeletal muscles in all individuals across species. So it's been developed during the evolution. If you stretch a muscle, it follows this dashed line, which is the passive muscle resistance to stretch due to connective tissues, tendons, and so forth. But at some level of stretch, some level of muscle length, it will start to resist stronger due to the action of stretch effects. This is lambda, this is threshold of the stretch effects. So we can write it briefly that active force of, let's subtract this dashed line and ignore it for the time being, that active force of the muscle is 0 when its length is shorter than lambda, and active force of the muscle is some kind of a function, doesn't matter what, of the difference between length and lambda when length is more than lambda. This is a law of nature. it has two variables that are salient for the muscle, and we're considering now only static conditions, which is force and length, and it has one parameter, lambda. So, for example, if lambda is fixed, you change force, length will change, but not lambda, and so forth. You stretch the muscle, force will change. So it will behave along this blue line, which is the characteristic of the stretch effects. So and there are a lot of data. By the way, this is not a hypothesis. I haven't yet hypothesized much. This is just an experimental fact that force is a function of length and the risk threshold of this dependence. It's also an experimental fact that this threshold changes under changes of supraspinal signals, under changes in gamma motor neuronal activity. Anatol mentioned those classical studies by Matthews. And it shifts. The characteristic shifts not exactly parallel to each other, but most commonly these characteristics do not intersect. That's not a very crucial point, but I'm going to draw them as if shifting parallel to each other simply for simplicity. If you stimulate different structures in the brain, which again Arlovsky and Feldman did some years ago and then was also done by others, you see this characteristic shifting more or less parallel to each other. So lambda shifts and there are no other changes in the system. So you can make a conclusion that descending signals from the brain induced by that stimulation changed lambda within this law of nature. So what kind of movements happen in such a system? Well, first of all, if you change external load, the muscle will move. So if you started with a muscle acting against a load that corresponding to a certain muscle force that balances this load in this state, this equilibrium point 1, at a certain value of muscle length, now you remove the load, you do unloading, and the whole system moves to a new equilibrium point with a new value of force, a new value of length, a new magnitude of muscle activation, a new value of stiffness. Since the characteristic is nonlinear, stiffness in this point and stiffness in that point are different. Okay, so this is how passive movements happen, or we can call them involuntary movements. What about voluntary movements? Well, you have to change lambda because it's parametric control. You control your movements by changing parameters of the relevant law of nature. So you change your lambda 1 to lambda 2. What's going to happen with the system? Well, you actually don't know because it depends on the characteristics of the external load. If the load remains constant, it's not a function of the spatial coordinate, muscle length, then you will move parallel to the muscle length, and only muscle length will change without a change in muscle force. However, if the load is not isotonic, then you can move to any point on this new characteristic with any combination of muscle force, length, activation, and so forth. All right. Now let's generalize it for any effector. So the famous person named Hajan Nasreddin, a famous scientist of the past, invented a way of controlling stubborn donkeys by putting a carrot on the end of the stick and putting it in front of the donkey's face. So the donkey wants to move to the carrot. The carrot plays the role of a spatial attractor for the donkey. Of course, the donkey cannot move its head just by extending its neck. So it has to translate this desired motion that's introduced by the reference spatial coordinate, the carrot coordinate in space, has to translate it to changes in reference coordinates for legs. Now, this is probably done with some participation of the central pattern generator in the spinal cord, but again, the legs cannot move by themselves. They are moved by motion of the joints. And the joints cannot move by themselves. They're moved by muscle contractions. So for any effector, starting from the whole body and down to muscle or even submuscle structures, we can say that active forces generated on effectors are produced by the difference between the actual coordinate of the effector and reference coordinate of the effector. And a very straightforward experiment, if you look at my digits, which are holding the cup, they're producing forces to make sure that the cup doesn't slip out of the hand. But what kind of a command did I actually send to my digits? It's very easy to find out. You just take the cup out and you will see that they move towards each other involuntarily, and they may touch each other, or if they're not perfectly aligned, they'll move even across each other. So when I produce force on the object, I did not encode force button by my descending signals. I encoded something different, and force happened because there are rigid walls of this object in my hand. And it's easy to find out what I encoded. I just remove the object from the hand, and you can see where my fingers really wanted to be, what the reference coordinates are. So reference coordinates are not a metaphor, they really exist. And we can record them experimentally, although this is not a trivial enterprise, and I'll get to it in a certain time. So here is our definition of the efferent process. Because before we go to efferent copy, I promised to define efferent process. So efferent process is a hierarchy of reference coordinates from the task level, which can involve the whole body, like the donkey and the carrot, to limbs, joints, muscles, and maybe even motor units or groups of motor units, which are the smallest elements controllable because they obey the law all or none. They cannot, you cannot go deeper down than that. At the level of muscles, the reference coordinate is equivalent to lambda. These are all, and then there are feedbacks. So those back coupling loops, somewhat resembling what Gregor talked about. These back coupling loops can do different things. They can be within the central nervous system, very short latency ones, or they can be mediated by sensory signals. Then there are relatively long time delays. So it looks like a series of redundant or ill-posed projections because you have a relatively low dimensional input, and it produces higher and higher and higher and outrageously higher dimensional output in terms of the degrees of freedom, how many variables exist at each level. So at the level of the whole body, the carrot, it only a three-dimensional, it encodes a three-dimensional point, so only a three-dimensional variable. At the level of muscles, the number of involved muscles may be 100, and the number of motor units may be 10,000. I don't know. But these are much, much larger values. So are these problems of motor redundancy, which are one of the major problems in motor control, again, following Bernstein? And I would say not necessarily. It's a completely different talk, would be about talking about the principle of abundance. And I like to address this excess of degrees of freedom, apparent degrees of freedom at each level, as abundance, which has a different connotation as something that you enjoy, as something useful. So I think it's a useful feature that allows stabilizing salient variables at the level of performance. And this is directly relevant to the uncontrolled manifold-based method that Gregor talked about, that was introduced by Gregor and our wonderful colleague John Schultz. And it also is very useful for performing multiple tasks with a set of effectors. So if your effectors contribute to a task, they have a lot of freedom to do something else on top of that within that uncontrolled manifold. And that wouldn't violate the original task, because uncontrolled manifold, by definition, is the solution space for salient performance variables. So this means that if you are constrained to the uncontrolled manifold, you are performing your task very well. However, if you move along the uncontrolled manifold, values of your elemental variables change, and as a result, you can do other things. But again, this would be a different talk. And this is probably the most famous experiment illustrating, or the oldest experiment illustrating the concept of motor abundance. It was by Bernstein, performed in the 1920s, published in the 1930 full-length paper. He studied professional blacksmiths who were asked to do their professional task of hitting the chisel held by the non-dominant hand with a hammer moved by the dominant hand. He used a beacon system of that time, which was Stone Age, of course, which involved putting electric bulbs on important parts of the body and then filming it on the black background. And then measuring everything frame by frame by hand, of course. So when he performed this analysis, he discovered a very interesting result, that the tip of the hammer showed the most consistent trajectory across consecutive hits compared to individual joint rotations. This is, by the way, I remember that this discussion with Gregor that we had was preempted the birth of the uncontrolled manifold hypothesis. I remember that I was giving Gregor a ride to the airport in Chicago during his visit, and we started thinking, how could Bernstein compare trajectory of the hammer in linear coordinates with joint trajectories in angular coordinates? How did he do that? And then, I think that was a very important discussion at the time. Well, it was in 1995 or 94, something like that. Anyway, he discovered that joints were highly variable in their rotations across trials, but the hammer followed more or less the same trajectory, much less variable. It's a very, very non-trivial result, of course, because the brain cannot send signals to the hammer. It can only send signals to muscles. So how come that the signals from the brain allow muscles to be very free to rotate the way they want, and the hammer, which is apparently outside the brain control, follows the same trajectory? So it's very, very nice illustration of the principle of abundance. When you use multiple elements, and the more is better, it's easier to control the system with more elements than with fewer elements, unlike what is more commonly assumed when people use the notion of redundancy. Like fewer elements are easier to control. Absolutely not. Okay, so let's get back to perception. And again, we'll start with a few introductory points. First of all, what's perception? Perception to me is measurement of a salient variable. And you can self-report this measurement to yourself or to other parts of the central nervous system, or report it to others, or use it to drive your action, like in perception action coupling. So how do people measure variables? Well, you have to do two things to measure a variable. You have to have a reference point from where to measure, and you have to have a measuring tool. Well, you have to have a definition, what's zero, and you have to have a tool that measures how far you are from that zero. Again, I haven't said yet anything hypothetical. It's just definition. So let's start with a very straightforward working hypothesis, that efference copy is a copy of the referent coordinate taking part in perception at the right level of our hierarchy that I showed you 2 slides ago. So if you care about your joint position in space, it's referent coordinate at the level of joint. If you care about fingertip, referent coordinate finger or fingertip, and so forth. But we should make this distinction. We assume that it's an efference copy. So our assumption is that the referent coordinate used in the process of action is the same referent coordinate that's used for the purpose of perception. This is already a hypothesis. This is not trivial, that the zero that I define during my action process is the same zero that I then use for the perception process. So we're going to test this hypothesis. Okay, so first of all, even for a single muscle, we have an abundance, a huge abundance of relevant information. So let's assume that our efference copy or efferent component of perception is our referent coordinate. For the muscle, it's lambda, it's the same thing. This is the muscle force length characteristic. By the way, as soon as you specify your lambda, you already, in a sense, solved part of the perception process. Because from the very beginning, without knowing lambda, you can be anywhere on this two-dimensional space. Your force length combinations can be any. As soon as you define this line, you now know that you are somewhere on this line. So your control process solved part of your perception, reducing it from a two-dimensional array to a one-dimensional array, which is easier to handle. Now let's take a look. What happens with typical signals, relevant signals, along this line? The length of the muscle increases. This means that signals from 1A, primary and secondary efferents from the spindles all increase. Force also increases. This means that signals from Golgi tendon organs also go up. Signals from alpha motor neurons increase because of the larger active force, so the EMG also goes up. Well, we can go further and say that the signals from gamma motor neurons also increase because of the alpha-gamma co-activation, but let's not complicate the situation. So in general, in order to find where you are on this line, you can use any of those signals, or you can use any combination of them. And by the way, there have been quite a few recent studies suggesting that muscle spindle endings are sometimes respond to force, and Golgi tendon organs are sometimes respond to length. So to me, it's not surprising at all, because it's all tied up together in a living muscle. Okay. By the way, references you can find in that review that I put into the list of recommended readings. So we have an abundant set of sources of information. Of course, if we go from one muscle to more than one muscle to a joint crossed by, I don't know, 6 muscles, then we have 6 lambdas. Then we have even more sources of information, because all these signals come from different muscles. So it's really a very, very high dimensional set. Let's consider first, just as an example of thinking, let's consider the vibration-induced kinesthetic illusions, very well-known phenomena that have been studied since 1960s, I believe, when Lund and Hagbert published the first studies of these illusions. The most common interpretation of the illusion is the following. You apply vibrator to a muscle or to its tendon. It leads to very high frequency of firing of 1A efferents, so primary endings, which are velocity sensitive, because vibration is at a high frequency. It leads to small changes in muscle length, but at a very high frequency. And as a result, it leads to perception of new positions of the body that correspond to that muscle stretch. And that's been the most common interpretation of illusions and their consequences. Well, let's not just believe it, but consider what will happen with a joint if you put a vibrator on one of the muscles, for example, on the extensor. And let's assume that the flexor is not vibrated. Vibration is propagating through soft tissues, but let's assume that the extensor is far enough and it doesn't get much of vibration. So if it gets a little, it's much less than the extensor. So what can we expect to happen? Well, let's imagine that the extensor length is being perceived as larger, but the flexor length is not, because it's not vibrating. So what should you expect? What kind of a percept do you expect? You should expect an impossible percept. You should expect violation of the anatomy of the joint, because one muscle became longer without the opposing muscle becoming shorter. However, people don't report that. They report this. that the opposing muscle became shorter and the muscle that's vibrated became longer. Well, first of all, this is a wrong percept. It doesn't correspond to signals from the muscles. Yes, and let's of course assume that the efferent process is the same. It's not changed by vibration, which is a wrong assumption, by the way, but we'll get to that. Interestingly, these percepts are unstable. These illusions are unstable. We did a study with Anatol Feldman. Well, it was published in 1982, so this makes us very old. We did a study when we showed that the direction of the vibration-induced kinesthetic illusion can reverse very easily under the action of irrelevant variables and irrelevant actions. So this is a very unstable illusion. There are people who show very strong illusions, and then there are people who show no illusions, that they refuse to report that there is anything happening with their joint. Although, again, with some tricks, you can find out that something is happening, but they don't report those illusions. So this is a strangely enough, this is a phenomenon that I think requires reconsideration, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's assume that you have a muscle with a certain lambda and certain combination of force and length. Now let us assume that you put a vibrator on that muscle. Let's forget about the antagonist. Well, the 1A efferents fire more. So this means that you perceive your position on this line not as the white equilibrium point, but, for example, this black equilibrium point. It corresponds to a certain value of muscle length under vibration, but it also corresponds to a certain value of force under vibration. So, from this scheme, we can already say that vibration should lead not only to positional illusions, it should lead to force illusions. Actually, force illusions, or something very similar to force illusions under vibration, were reported earlier in a study by Caparelli and Kostka. It's a relatively old study. They interpreted it as results of effects of vibration on Golgi tendon organs, which in a relaxed muscle are close to zero. In an activated muscle, there are responses of Golgi tendon organs, but actually, if you start thinking about that, it doesn't fit. We did that study not that long ago, and yes, there are force illusions under vibration. However, they also don't fit this picture very well. Their direction and their magnitude. Their patterns suggest effects of vibration on the efferent copy. So, we are getting to a situation relatively unpleasant, and by the way, we suggested it by Feldman again in 1982 in a different study, that vibration has to lead to shifts in lambda, otherwise you cannot explain effects of vibration that had been known at that time. So this suggests to us that when you put vibrator on the muscle, your lambda that's used for action and your lambda that's used for perception are not the same, or your referent coordinate used for perception are not the same. So it looks like our initial hypothesis that referent coordinate for perception and referent coordinate for action are equivalent is wrong. This is, by the way, one of my favorite illustrations of unstable percepts. So visual perception can also be unstable. Of course, nothing moves on the screen. You can look at this picture and you have, it's a very strong perception of this wobbling square in the center, although nothing moves. All right, so stability of percepts, we're getting to that point. It's is highly non-trivial, and I would say it's evolutionarily probably crucial, because if your perception of a predator or of prey is unstable and you are not sure where the prey or predator is, you're probably not going to survive in the evolutionary process. And here is an example, a non-trivial example. You can, again, run this experiment on yourself now, or you can trust me. So you can co-contract muscles acting about...
Hey, what's up?
Yeah? Huh? Oh no, these are... Guys, if you don't want to speak, keep your microphone off, please. Keep your microphone off. I'm not sure whose microphone it is, but please. Okay. Consider co-contracting muscles about the joint, like elbow joint, stiffening the joint, without looking at it. You have the very correct, very strong perception that the joint doesn't move. It's a veridical perception that corresponds to reality. Where does this percept come from? Your efferent signals change. Your afferent signals from all receptors change. For you co-contract muscles, muscle fiber length changes, gamma motor neurons change their activation, Golgi tendon organs change their firing, articular capsule tangent changes, which leads to changes in the firing of articular receptors. So all relevant receptors change their firing. How do you know that you're not moving? Well, it's if all the salient sources of information change, afferent and efferent. And the same is true if you press against a stop, by the way. Same thing. This means to me, it's just a reformulation of this obvious observation that in this very multidimensional space of relevant variables, afferent and efferent, we have a stable subspace. Well, a manifold, a well-organized, stable subspace. I called it isoperceptual manifold, which sounds like uncontrolled manifold, but it only sounds like an uncontrolled manifold. It's a completely different animal. It is a manifold in the space of afferent and efferent signals corresponding to the same magnitude of a percept. So self-reported or reported to others. I cannot draw anything more than three-dimensional on the screen. So now you will have to use your imagination. Let's imagine that you have only two elements for simplicity, and they produce common output. And your signals to two elements, like two lambdas, two referent coordinates, they sum up to produce the referent coordinate of the same whole system, like you're pressing with two fingers, for example, on a surface. There is an uncontrolled manifold in the space of your two elements corresponding to a constant referent coordinate, to a constant sum, this line with negative space. So in the next picture, I'm not going to draw these two because I cannot draw four-dimensional things. I'm going to draw a three-dimensional picture with referent coordinate here, which can change, but keep in mind that it's actually a projection of two elements. And two afferent signals. Let's consider only one per element that contribute to perception of a certain salient variable. And again, let's assume that your variable, your percept, is the sum of everything. It doesn't have to be, but it's easier to draw. So this gray triangle corresponds to the constant sum of A1, A2, and RC, which is your percept. Now, if you're anywhere on that triangle, your percept doesn't change. So in the example with muscle co-activation, you change your E1, E2, A1, A2, and maybe like 500 more A's and E's of elemental variables, but you change them in a coordinated fashion so that you remain on this triangle. Motion in this space can be called perceptually equivalent. If you leave that space, this is not perceptually equivalent motion. So your percept changes. Now, first thing you can find out from this very straightforward picture is that you can have different percepts of individual elements, while your percept of the total output is more or less constant. So, in other ways, perception of a salient variable may be more accurate than perception of elements contributing to that variable. To our knowledge, no one has ever tested this hypothesis, and we did it in a couple of experiments. I'm going to show you results of one of those. The first one, when we asked people to press with four fingers of a hand And then, with constant force, visual feedback, so nothing drifts, we will ask them, okay, show me what your middle finger is doing. So press with the middle finger with the same force as the middle finger of the first hand. Show me what the little finger is doing, or ring finger. Okay, now show me what they are all doing. And in the control experiments, we ask them to press with a hand with only one finger and show me what it's doing. Because, of course, you are not going to match perfectly. So we have this matching task in single finger tasks, and we have this matching task in a multi-finger task when you are asked to match single fingers. And you can it's shown as F4 and F1, and you can see that the constant error is way smaller and the variable error is way smaller. And of course, right, left. That's quite a strong effect. When your finger participates in a multi-finger task, you don't know what it is doing. I don't know, it told me that my internet connection is not good. Is it, or is it, are there problems?
There was a brief lack of audio, but it's back now.
It's back now? Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. All right, so if it's okay now, then I'll continue. Now let's get to two commands, because now just saying reference coordinate is insufficient. Let's consider the fact that all our movements are driven by muscle groups that are acting in the direction of desired movement and against that direction. I'm going to call them agonists and antagonists. Each one of them is controlled by its own lambda. So this picture shows, for example, joint torque controlled by only two muscles. Again, there are passive characteristics, which we will ignore in future, and characteristics of the reflex of agonist, which produces positive torques, and antagonist, which produces negative torques. So you can move this lambda agonist and lambda antagonist in any way you wish. And by the way, this can then be generalized for any effector which produces force and coordinate. Like if I press with a finger, there are many muscles that contribute to pressing force. There are also muscles that resisting active force. I can consider them agonist group, antagonist group, reference coordinate for agonists, reference coordinate for antagonists. So same picture. One can draw the sum of these two characteristics, algebraic sum, which will correspond to the mechanical characteristic of the effector, of the joint or of the fingertip, if you wish. I'm going to address the point of intersection. That's the point where the muscle forces are balanced in their effects at the level of the joint or the finger. And I'm going to call it reference coordinate, just for the sake of not having too many words, too many terms. So, but it's a reference coordinate at the effector level already. Okay. What can you do to this reference coordinate? Well, you can shift it. And this is done by the so-called reciprocal command or R command, when you move your lambda agonist and lambda antagonist together in the same direction, to the left or to the right. Then the shape of this overall characteristic is not going to change, but the point of intercept is going to change. So the R command defines this reference coordinate or at the effector level. The spatial distance between lambda agonist and lambda antagonist is called the C command or co-activation command. Now, if I change the C command, so I move my lambdas in opposite directions in such a way that this intersection point doesn't change, the midpoint doesn't change, what is going to happen is this characteristic of the effector will start to rotate. It is going to be relatively shallow for small values of the C command, and it's going to be steeper for large values. So when you co-activate muscles, your effector becomes effectively stiffer. Well, we're only talking about local effects in the vicinity of the 0 point, because of course, if you go beyond the co-activation range, then only one muscle is active, the characteristic becomes nonlinear, and so forth. So at the mechanical level, if you study the effector, Your R command defines referent coordinate, so the point where the opposing muscles balance each other, and your C command defines slope of this characteristic or its apparent stiffness. And I'm going to use K for that. So again, RC and K are not commands. They are mechanical reflections of those commands. All right? Commands are both spatial, both referent coordinates. But one of them is kind of midpoint between the two, and the other one is distance between the two, the range between the two. All right. One of the problems, well, before I show, let me first show you the first experiment with non-trivial results. I promised you that theories should predict something non-trivial and interpret it. So let me try this experiment. Here is what the subject is doing. So the subject is sitting, placing two pairs of fingers on four senses. So there are four senses, index and middle of one of the hand. I'm going to call it the task hand on one pair of senses, index and middle of the match hand on the other pair of senses. Everything is symmetrical, and there is visual feedback on the force of the task hand fingers only, combined. Okay, so one level of force. Here is the task. Reach a certain level of force, for example, 10% of maximal. So it's comfortable, very easy to do. At this point where there is this dotted line, there is enough time to reach your force and to stabilize it. You are asked to co-activate muscles of the hand without changing the force of the task hand. And first, we demonstrate it to subjects and allow them to play. We tell them, okay, here is you can have it without any resistance, so zero force. You can co-contract without moving and without producing force, right? Okay, so we want you to co-contract without changing force. Clear? Clear. All right. The subjects are asked to co-activate muscles without changing the pressing force, and there is no visual feedback, of course. Then we ask the subjects after they get to a certain level and they are done. I mean, they say, okay, I'm there. All right, good. We then ask them, what's your force? Give me a number. The initial one was 10. What's it now? They give a number. And then we tell them, now match this force with the other hand. Produce the same level of force. So these are the three questions which I can ask all of you, and those who don't know these studies, I can bet you a lot that you will probably have all three wrong. But let me show you the results. This is what happens. So the subject gets to a certain level of force, this 10. Visual feedback disappears. The subject co-activates muscles. The force increases. The instruction is don't change force. The force increases substantially. Then the subject is asked, tell us what the force is. And the subject says it dropped. Not by much, but it dropped. Then the subject is told, okay, now match it. And the subject is matching either accurately or overmatching. Okay? Well, I think it's a very non-trivial set of results. So this picture shows you the statistics, or left hand, right hand. So the white column is the verbal report. These are the actual increased force, and then there is a drift, but it's still increased, and this is the match, which is overmatched, matched or overmatched. So how do we interpret it within our own picture? Okay, here we are. This is force. This is coordinate which never changes. Conditions are isometric. So let's start with this point. Under visual feedback, the subject are asked to match the target. All right, they have a combination of R and C command that corresponds to referent coordinate 1 and apparent stiffness 1 of the fingertips taken together. All right. Now the subjects are asked co-contract muscles without changing force. This means they change their co-activation command from a certain magnitude to a larger magnitude, which corresponds to a larger apparent stiffness of the characteristic. This one. Well, you expect an increase in force if they don't do anything else. They're not told anything about RNC commands. They're just told not to change force. In order for them to match the forces, they have to reduce their R command, to move it towards zero, reduce its magnitude. It's negative here because we use zero for actual coordinate. So if they reduce it a little bit, it becomes smaller, and the overshoot becomes smaller. If they reduce it even more, they can come close to the force, but nobody does it. So now they're asked, what is the force you produce? And they say it is smaller. So basically, they tell us the R command when they're asked to verbally report force. They have troubles incorporating the C command into their perception of force. They tell us that the force dropped while it actually increased. As in this gray circle, the force is higher, but their R command is smaller. And by the way, we then will get to the point how you can measure these things. All right. So this is kind of illustration number one, suggesting that this whole framework is generative. It generates suggestions for new studies. It allows you to generate new predictions for those studies. These predictions are not trivial, and it allows you to offer an interpretation for those predictions. But these interpretations, of course, have an effect on your simplistic original scheme. Our original scheme of interaction of efferent and efferent signals was quite simplistic. And it's probably wrong. So if your conclusions...
Excuse me, did you explain how the matching, how you predict the matching?
We'll get to the matching. Yes, we'll get to the matching. The matching is a complex thing, partly because then we had a large study about matching. Largely because people tend to overmatch anyway. Even under any perfect conditions, in isometric conditions, people usually overmatch forces. Not by much. It's not as much as here. But we'll get to that point. Thanks, Greg. So a few conclusions. Effects of the C command may not be incorporated adequately into percepts, which is interesting. Well, it's probably condition specific, because when you co-contract muscles in this position and space, you don't have any illusions. So it's maybe specific to perception of force rather than coordinate. And the second one, because matching and verbal reports are so different, it suggests that perceiving to act and perceiving to report are likely to involve different mechanisms. Like similar to those dorsal and ventral streams for vision introduced by Mel Goodale and his friends. So there are two streams, and well known for clinicians, when people may report no visual perception in a hemifield after stroke, but they can catch a ball thrown in that hemifield. So those signals, they don't contribute to perception to report. They don't report visual signals there, but it can be incorporated into action. And we have here the same, but at the level of proprioception. Like in this picture, perception to report is dramatically different from perception to act. It's actually a qualitative difference in different directions. All right, so let's consider another phenomenon, very well known. It's been known for quite some time, like 20 years. It's a study of David Valancourt and Danny Russell some time ago, when they reported that when you turn off visual feedback during isometric force production, the force shows an unintentional drift down, which is larger for higher initial force levels, and it's not fatigue. They took a look at that. They invoked problems with working memory. I don't think it works, but we're not going to discuss it now. But this is a very strong phenomenon. These drifts happen all the time. Now we, in our lab, I mean, you can see these drifts more frequently than you don't. which is partly due to the infamous back coupling, we believe, of the referent coordinates towards actual coordinates in certain conditions. So here is our interpretation. Let's use the same illustration. If you present a referent coordinate to the donkey, there is direct coupling from referent coordinate to actual coordinate and the donkey starts to move. We call it direct coupling, and it's fast. It's limited primarily by neural delays, so let's say 100 milliseconds, give or take a few. However, what if the donkey cannot move? If there is a wall in front of the donkey, a glass wall, it can see the carrot, but it cannot move. Well, according to our current thinking, the donkey has telekinetic powers. Well, I'm exaggerating, of course, and it starts to think, and the carrot starts to move to the donkey. Now, the carrot is virtual, we should realize in this description. It's a referent coordinate which is generated within the central nervous system. And this is a slow process. Like in the previous pictures, the typical exponents are, say, 10, 15 seconds. So it's maybe 2 orders of magnitude slower. That's why they haven't been really described in detail before, because people usually don't study actions over such long times, or steady state actions. They rarely do. So maybe using a little bit more scientific language, we can say that there is a potential field, there is our effector, and there is a spatial coordinate, say, a single spatial coordinate. When you specify a referent coordinate for that effector, it's an attractor in that potential field that corresponds to minimum of the potential, and actual coordinate of the effector is attracted to the referent coordinate. Now, how do you produce movements? You shift the referent coordinate, you shift your lambda. You shift your referent coordinate, as a result, the actual coordinate very quickly follows that shift and it moves towards the referent coordinate. And you observe the movement or a change in force depending on external conditions. What happens when you block it? You don't allow the object to move. Well, what happens is that then the referent coordinate starts to drift slowly towards actual coordinate. There are actually 2 types of such drift, fast and slow. The fast one has the exponent of between 1 and 2 seconds. It's actually still slow as compared to direct effects, which are typical times of 100 milliseconds, but only 1 order of magnitude slower. The slow one may be 10 or more seconds. We actually now, we cannot claim it, but we think, I think, that the fast one originates in the orthogonal direction to the uncontrolled manifold of any task, and the slow one originates within the uncontrolled manifold, which is less stable, and as a result, characteristic times there are longer. And so drifts along the uncontrolled manifold happen slower, and along orthogonal direction, they happen faster. And these 2 are coupled. So they are, although they are orthogonal in mathematical sense, but they're not non-independent. So as a result, we can see orthogonal drifts induced by drifts within the uncontrolled manifold. But that's kind of maybe too much. Okay, so the question is, how can we measure these things? And let me show you the tool that we use. Well, generally, this has been a really sore problem within the equilibrium point hypothesis. We don't have lambda meters. We don't have tools that allow to measure those referent coordinates and lambdas reliably during movements or during any kind of action. Mindy and Anatol have been using a very clever method, but it is only for subjects who are relaxed. We did something with Jerry Gottlieb, but that required using a questionable model of the moving effector, because we really don't know these parameters, or many of the parameters had to be guessed. So we had this tool in our lab already for quite some time. We call it the inverse piano. it applies positional perturbations for a force task. Before that, with Jerry Gottlieb, I applied force perturbation for positioning task. But this is better, and I will explain you why, at least for our purposes. By the way, you cannot do the engineering system identification techniques like quick perturbation and looking at the response function of the system and then finding out its parameters, because if your window of analysis is very short, you don't allow reflexes time to act. And then you effectively test the behavior of the deafferent system. If your window of analysis is longer and you allow the reflexes to act, then there will be changes in parameters of the system that you try to identify due to that feedback. And it's really a catch-22. So anyway, so system identification techniques do not work. The only thing you can do is change external conditions in a tricky way and instruct your subjects not to react. That's what Anatole did in his classical early studies when he asked his subjects not to intervene. Now, well, there's always a question, can they not intervene or not? And the longer we now study it, we realize that, well, it depends on many factors. Like all these unexpected drifts or unintentional drifts that happen all the time, they suggest that, well, referent coordinates drift. So if you measure over a certain period of time, your measurement can correspond to a different value of your referent coordinate compared to the initial steady state. So, all right, here is how we try to deal with it. So inverse piano, it's called inverse piano because in the real piano, you press on keys. In the inverse piano, keys press on you. So you press with your fingers on 4 sensors. The 4 sensors are powered by linear motors programmable from the bottom. You don't see them. And as a result, they can be moved up and down in a controlled fashion. Let's take a look at the graphs on the right. This is force produced by the subject. And this is sensor coordinate, which starts from 0. So that's the initial state. The subject is asked after a certain amount of time. And at that time, we turn off visual feedback for a short period, relatively, to kind of help the subject not to react. So the subject doesn't see feedback changing. But the subject is told, allow the system to move your fingers. Don't yield, don't resist, just allow your fingers to do whatever they want. And now we lift the finger over half a second. And then we immediately put it down. But we don't analyze this down portion at this moment. So when the finger goes up, its force increases because it has those spring-like properties. And we take it away from its referent coordinate. Remember, when you produce force, your referent coordinate is below the finger. It's inside the object. And some stiffness produces it into force. So now we plot displacement against force, and we ignore the first 50 milliseconds because then reflexes have no way to act. We also ignore the very late portion when we feel like subjects may be reacting already. If we do that, we get a dependence of force on displacement, which is very close to a straight line. Now, we only accept data when the R value of this reaction is 0.9. That's in most studies typically what we accept. So if it's 0.9, we say, okay, we take the intercept as the referent coordinate, and we take the slope as apparent stiffness. Okay? All right, so then for this trial, we have referent coordinate and slope. Let's now do it before the drift and after the drift. This is a study with Sasha Reshetko. The left picture, take a look. These are 20 trials or so. This measurement first, so inverse piano lifted the finger up, actually the whole hand, but it doesn't matter, up and down before the drift. then visual feedback disappeared, and then after the drift. So before the drift are open triangles, after the drift are those gray circles, are the data points. And the uncontrolled manifold, by the way, here is hyperbolic, because the force is a function of reference coordinate and this apparent stiffness. This is at the mechanical level. And if you want to produce a certain value of force, you can covary the two in a hyperbolic way, because the force is the product of two, assuming that the initial position is 0. All right, here we are. Well, that's very hyperbolic. The R squared is 0.99. By the way, most of those R squared are completely unseemly. Usually don't get that. After the drift, the force dropped. The uncontrolled manifold now doesn't match the data as well. So partly stability is lost of the action. It's not surprising, because a drift in force by itself means partial loss of stability. By the way, subjects are unaware of it. All these drifts, they can reach up to 35–40% of the initial force. And the subjects say that they are keeping the same force. So our force sense is really, really lousy. Because we're not applying vibration, we're not playing with anything. The subjects have access to all the information in their body, and they have no idea what they are doing. All right, so we can say the drifts. Reference coordinate became larger on average, and K became smaller. So the C command drifted down, and the R command failed to compensate for the change in C command. But it tried. It's like in the first picture with co-contraction, when the C command went up and the R command failed to compensate for it, although it drifted in the right direction. Okay, now what will happen if we keep the feedback all the time on the screen? Here are the data, and you can see that now the two regression lines are on top of each other, not surprising, because the subjects are producing the same force. R squared values are very similar, like 0.98, also not bad. But we can see that the subjects drifted along the uncontrolled manifold to a new position corresponding to smaller co-contraction, smaller C command. But now the R command was adjusted perfectly well because they had visual feedback to do that. Okay. Now we ran relatively recently a similar study, and we looked at a little bit more detail with the same tools. So the initial force of the subject ranged from 10% to 30%. And we asked to do the matching. So now we'll get to Gregor's point about matching. So the subject at 10% show virtually no drift. And by the way, this thing shows inverse piano applied. So to measure RC and K, those reference coordinate and apparent stiffness. As we increase force, the drift becomes larger and larger and larger and larger. And for 30%, you can see that more than 1/3, or maybe about 1/3 on average of the force dropped. So it's maybe more than 30% drift. Again, the subjects have no idea what's going on. Interestingly, they overmatch consistently by about the same amount. They are not always on the target, which I actually expected them to be on the target, because I thought they would remember the initial force and they would try to do the same. They don't. So this picture shows you better these results. So these are initial target forces from 10 to 30. The target force is shown here by this dashed line, what they had to do, and they did, of course, with visual feedback. Now, the green pictures show how they drifted down, and the red ones show what they did when they were asked to match. And this is the difference on the bottom, between the task hand and match hand. Match hand always overshoots, and the amount of overshoot doesn't really consistently change with the target force. although the amount of drift does. Okay? So we have drifts that depend on the initial force, and we have matching errors that are invariant. When you deal with an invariant thing, it's always kind of fun and revealing across conditions. So what's happening in the match hand and in the task hand at the level of those reference coordinate and this apparent stiffness, which is a reflection of the C command? Well, the reference coordinate in the task hand is smaller, in the match hand is larger. The K, the other way around, but the difference is not that much. So the matching hand produced much larger reference coordinate, maybe corresponding to the initial one, we don't know, because we didn't do two inverse pianos, that would be too cumbersome for the procedure. So the difference between the reference coordinates in the match hand and task hand is always about the same. The difference in the apparent stiffness scales with force, but it is insufficient to compensate. So it's smaller in the task hand. This is larger. Minus value means larger because reference coordinate is negative by the convention of measurement. Okay, so our first interpretation, what does it mean? So what does it mean that if reference coordinate absolute value becomes larger and K is smaller? So this means that our reference coordinate moved to the left. K, the slope became smaller, but the overall force larger because there is an offshoot. So A illustrates the picture. It can only be achieved by one thing. You can trust me, or you can play yourself with all possible alternatives, because we did. Only if there is a shift of the reference coordinate for the antagonist muscle towards zero. This is the only effect that can produce this combination of findings. For example, this B and C illustrate what happens if reference coordinate for the agonist muscles is shifting. If it's shifting to the right, you will have actually a drop in force, which is wrong, and a smaller reference coordinate, which is also wrong. If it drifts to the left, then the K should be larger, but it is smaller, it's reduced by K. Well, if your C command only changes, then K should change, but our C should not. If your reference coordinate only changes, then it can change, but K should not. But that's not what we observe. They are all different between the two hands. They all shift. So this is an interesting result, which strongly suggests that reference coordinate used for perception is not reference coordinate used for action. Basically, efferent's copy is not a copy of the efferent process. That's why I think that the word combination efferent's copy has to be trashed, frankly speaking. It's completely misleading. First of all, it doesn't define efference, but if we define it and we run studies, we find out that it's not a copy. It changes. Now, in the same study, we use vibration. I understand that you are tired, but nevertheless, this is, I think, the last big bit of data that I'm going to show you. Vibration could be applied to the task hand or to the match hand. Otherwise, the subjects are doing the same thing. They're using different forces, there is a drift, and they are used to match, and we measure RC and K. First of all, I unite here conditions with vibration of flexor and extensor muscles. We vibrated them separately, but the effects were the same. Isn't it interesting? According to all ideas, interpretations of vibration, it matters what muscle group you are vibrating, because the effects are modulated by changes in 1A endings, primary endings in the spindle of the vibrated muscle, not of its antagonist. Okay, antagonist is not that far. I mean, the forearm is not that large. But nevertheless, the amount of vibration received by the antagonist is way smaller than by the agonist. We estimate it. It's about 1 order of magnitude smaller. So effects were the same whether we vibrate flexor or extensor. And the second important fact, task hand drift showed no effects of vibration. So the amount of drift and the direction of force drift was the same. From there, we conclude that vibration has no effect on the motor process, only on the perceptual process. Because if it had effects on motor process, it should have effects on the task hand drift or on the task hand performance. All right. Well, the results are, this is match hand, and it depends, the effects of vibration depend whether you vibrate the match hand or the task hand, by the way. These are effects, referent coordinate, if you vibrate the task hand, the match hand show larger referent coordinate. If you vibrate the match hand, show smaller referent coordinate. In the match hand, the effects are seen only also in K. They are larger when you vibrate the task hand. They are smaller when you vibrate the match hand. Okay. Interpretations, same. It is only possible if referent coordinate to the antagonist is distorted before it's used for perception. So we get really to this very strange set of data. There is something about the referent coordinate to the antagonist muscle group, which makes perception unstable and which produces all the drifts. So it affects both performance of the task hand because drifts are different and depend on that. But it also affects perception because depending on the vibration, you have, that's what happens, and this is what you do to compensate for it, or for what happens, because you at the perceptual level. Well, these are complicated pictures, but well, what can I say? However, we can. Yes. Hello. Well, I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. There is something. If you are trying to ask something, do something with the microphone. Yeah? No, there is something with your microphone. I'm sorry. Or with somebody else's microphone. Hard to say. All right, I have only a couple of slides left, so we can get to these issues in like 3 minutes. So to put everything together, this is the scheme that we have currently for the motor process, referent coordinates to the task, and that I mean this involves the R command and the C command. There is an efference copy of that, which is used for perception, but it is not equal to perception. It is not equal to the referent copy of the task. It has effects of time, as we can see with drifts, and of vibration. And then it is used for the matching, and that's what you observe. You observe performance of the match hand. So there are non-perceived drifts in referent coordinate for the antagonist muscle towards the actual coordinate, a reduction which leads to the reduction of the co-activation command in particular. Why is it limited? Because you cannot go beyond. It makes no sense. So there is a very strong kind of rule that when we perform our actions, our co-activation command is never 0 or below 0. So reference coordinate for the antagonist drifts and stops, doesn't drift further. So basically, efference copy is not a copy of efference. And now it asks a very interesting question. Do we really perceive what antagonist muscles are doing? I don't know any studies of that. But I have a feeling, just by trying it on myself, that I have no idea what my antagonists are doing. So, for example, if you try to press against a stock very, very strongly, your antagonists are activated to 10-15% of their maximal possible level, so substantially. Try to do that. Now relax. Now try to activate antagonists to the same magnitude. You have no idea what to do. So we don't perceive signals to antagonist muscles. This leads to all these drifts and perceptual errors that are so abundant in our field. All right, let me summarize more or less philosophically. I wanted to try to persuade you that there is a feasible physical and physiological simultaneously approach to biological movements based on the idea of control with reference coordinates, from single muscle to whole body. It satisfies the requirements for a good theory. It can account for known observations, it can predict new observations, and sometimes in the field of motor control and sometimes in the field of kinesthetic perception. And I try to show you a few, like, for example, in motor control, those non-perceived and unexpected drifts in forces that happen. In the field of perception, all those verbal reports and matching trials. It forms, this approach, the basis for a number of established concepts, including the efference copy. But it is a distorted copy of at the effector level of the reference coordinate. And the distortion is due primarily, we cannot say 100%, to poor reproduction and drifts of reference coordinates to the antagonist muscles. I don't know how to study that. Well, we have, because of the COVID stuff, our lab has been a little bit depleted. So, I want to acknowledge a whole bunch of people who participated at different levels at different times in experiments that have been performed in our lab. These are, well, many of them contributed very significantly. I hope I didn't miss any important names, but maybe if I did, please tell me, and I will add more next time. And currently, we're very small. There are not that many people in the lab. But nevertheless, we try to do our job. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen and get to the chat and the questions. Okay. All right. What is the contribution of the mass of the hammer to trajectory stability? What happens if you replace the hammer? I don't know, Roger. I didn't run this experiment, and Bernstein, when he performed this study, he used only one hammer, as far as I know, and that was the hammer that these blacksmiths usually used during their work. He didn't explore that. I suspect, based on a bunch of experiments within the uncontrolled manifold hypothesis that were partly run by Greg Ensch and John Schultz and partly in our lab, that mechanics, at least within a certain range, doesn't mean that much. That there are those effects, stability of the endpoint trajectory of the endpoint action by covariate across trials adjustment of elements or contributions of elements, that is quite robust. So it is, it works more or less across such variations as the weight of the object. Experiments of reaching with a stick show that the tip of the stick is stabilized using UCM method. So principle of effect does not depend on mass of the hammer. That's Raoul. Thank you very much, Raoul. Overshoot studies. Did you test this with the non-dominant hand? Yes. we did these studies from both right to left, left to right. Actually, most of our experiments, I work in the same department where Bob Sandberg works. And if you work close to Bob Sandberg, you have to pay attention to hand dominance. So to be on his good list of people. So we usually alternate. However, if like in 2-3 studies in a row, we see no change, no difference between the right and left hand, then we run similar studies with only one combination of hands, sometimes selected kind of randomly. Okay, but the answer is yes to that one. Okay, and Christian already answered. Roger to everyone. Now it started in French. How to translate referent coordinate to French? Well, Mindy, you are as bilingual as it comes. Well, it's better if you unmute yourself. Mindy, unmute yourself. No, you're still, we cannot hear.
Mark,
yeah.
I was working with Francis Lucien.
Yes.
I think he translated it coordinator reference or something like this.
Well, yeah, sounds like why not?
We have publication in French about reference body. Can be great. I can recommend it.
Okay.
But of course, French language is not my strong point.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
coordinate référent.
les coordonnées référentes ou l'aspect. Yeah,
Okay.
I think there isn't really a good translation for most terms in French.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, question from the other vibration reaction switching to another part of the body. Distant from the vibrated muscle. No, really vibrated, very far away muscle, like, I don't know, Achilles tendon and test finger forces. More likely than not, there will be not much, I suspect. But who knows? I mean, stranger things happen. So I don't have a good prediction. Let's put it that way. What will happen with the vibration of the muscles that we played with? We at least had some predictions to start with, which some of them were, by the way, falsified. Yeah. All right. Can we call learning as a process of converging the performance of both hands in the last experiment? I'm not sure this is what he means. Because what's converging? The two hands did not converge in the last experiment. They showed errors all the time, the two hands. I mean, the matching hand was always showing overshoots, and the difference in the magnitude of the overshoots was really, really small across conditions. It was consistent, but it was relatively small. So I'm not sure.
I was thinking about if you repeat the experiment several times, and I was expecting that the people would converge to the same result. That could explain.
It's hard to deal with these experiments and repeat them multiple times because people start to suspect. They kind of feel something is funny is going on, and they try to think and they try to correct their action because they think they're making errors and they want to avoid making these errors. So, for example, we ran an experiment with Latash, a bunch who was in my lab, and in that experiment, we gave subjects feedback after a series of drifts studies. So people press with a finger, drifted down, like, I don't know, 12 times. We show them the average performance after those 12 trials and tell them, continue. Well, it's interesting that people differ. the smart ones start to overshoot like crazy because they overcompensate. The careful ones, the ones that are kind of a little bit more scared, they overshoot less or they go closer to them. So the variability is quite large. And then those who overshoot on average, if you give them then, after 12 trials, you again show them. They start to undershoot again. So ultimately they converge. After 6, I think, times, they more or less converge on performance with little drift. So if you give feedback explicitly to people, they do correct their action and they converge on some behavior. But if you don't, but you just repeat the experiment multiple times, they start to suspect things at some point. So we want to avoid, this is an uncontrolled factor and want to avoid it. All right, so why don't we open it for the oral part of the discussion. So please unmute yourself and speak up.
I have a question, Mark.
Sure.
So the methodologies that you use to identify RNC commands in finger movements are very interesting for us when we're trying to understand problems in recovery of finger individualization. I don't even know how to say that word, after a stroke. So, you know, there's finger coupling, you know, coupling between fingers.
We call it enslaving.
Enslaving, yes.
Well, right.
Yeah. There's synergies, abnormal synergies on top of that, enslaving. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you can give us some insights into how we could even start to understand what's going on in the fingers in patients with stroke, for example, given all these other things that are going on.
It is. Now, if you asked me this question 2 years ago, I would probably give you a straightforward answer. You can measure enslaving by asking people to produce ramps with one finger at a time and without showing them feedback on the other fingers, but recording the other fingers' action. Yeah, and then you can, well, synergy analysis is relatively straightforward. You can do this analysis in the space of finger forces, or you can do it in the space of finger modes, as we usually do, which kind of takes out the enslaving portion. So we replace commands to fingers with so-called modes in such a way that you can change a mode one at a time without changing other modes, at least in general. Because enslaving itself into a structure into the data across trials of forces, measured forces, for example. You ask your subject to produce during the main task. So that's why we usually took them out. However, now...
Stop you for a sec. That would all be isometric.
I'm sorry?
That would all be isometric?
Yes, we usually do isometric. It's easier to measure because if you introduce motion, it becomes even more complicated because of so many joints involved. It's not 100% even clear what to measure.
Right.
So, but now, over the past year and a half or 2 years, we had a number of studies where we saw that enslaving drifts up at a very high speed. So after, say, 5 seconds, the index of enslaving can increase by 30-40%. And this really makes us worried now. What did we do before? What did we measure before? So there is, there is a series of papers published now, which are easy to find through PubMed. But in those studies, we show that, so we use these drifts, but in the experiment, we asked people to press with only a subset of fingers, like press with index and middle finger only. And we give them feedback on index and middle finger. But the other two fingers are enslaved, they press, and we see what happens with their force. It drifts up. Now we can ask people to press with index and middle finger, but give them feedback on the ring and little finger forces, sound, without telling them. We changed the gain on the screen so people didn't know what kind of feedback they received. Then the force of instructed fingers drifts down. So the drifts are actually not always down. In instructed fingers, it drifts down. In slave fingers, they drift up. Both correspond to an increase in the amount of enslaving. So we have, we suggested in one of the more recent studies, I think it was in neuroscience, that there may be several things happening. One of them is drifts in referent coordinates, or at the task level of the explicitly involved fingers. And the other one is kind of expansion of cortical excitation that involves the non-instructed fingers, the representations for it's relatively close. So if you keep excited the certain cortical neural populations, this excitation starts to spread and it takes over the nearby ones, and those enslaved fingers start to produce higher forces. Again, the subjects are completely unaware of what's happening. They think that nothing interesting is happening. So the same can we produce as a result of perturbations, other things. So there are several studies now published. It's a series. I think the last one was in neuroscience, but I'm not sure. So anyway, now I'm not as confident in enslaving as a reliable index of hand action anymore. So I think we should be very careful in our measurement of enslaving. I think we have some people with microphones on, but yeah, in our measurement of enslaving, because we have to make sure that first we don't apply any perturbations during that measurement, and second, that the time course is relatively short. Because anything more than 4 or 5 seconds, I would take it now with a lot of suspicion. So we can continue discussing it, but in general, I want to say that what we measure as enslaving is again drifting. These drifts are all the time, and they are drifting without subject's will. Subjects don't want this to happen. They try to do steady state tasks, and they cannot. And they all drift in the same direction. So it's very consistent for subject phenomenon.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
A brief question. Would it be useful to do such studies on feet and toes? And would it be useful to do such studies using the left side, so the upper limb and lower limb on one side and the contralateral side?
Of course, it would be very interesting, Roger. And if you want to join us as a volunteer, I will allow you to use our equipment to run such studies. So our main problem now is, as I mentioned, we are badly understaffed. We have very few people in the lab, and those who are there, they're involved in their own studies. They do their own projects, obviously. So we are quite limited in what else. Yes, I think these are very good questions. Foot representations, for example, are much smaller and different in the cortex. Now, foot enslaving is very hard to measure because really people are pretty bad at moving one toe at a time. So I suspect that we will have a lot of random data if we try to do that. With fingers, we're pretty good. But if you try to do this with your toes, you'll find out, no, not really. But across the feet is a very good question. Across on one side of the body, across upper and lower extremities is another very good question. I don't have an answer, so sorry. Vera, what about not changing any force at all, but ask subjects to match force. Well, if you just ask subjects to match force, they usually overmatch. Then what?
I want to say that if you don't change the force, but ask subject to match, that
to match
nothing.
They will not do anything.
Are you sure?
Well, if you don't ask them to do anything, they won't do it.
Oh, you ask them to match, but you don't.
But to match what? Because the word match means doing something that's similar to something. To match something. So what do you mean? Well, to produce 10 newtons, ask them to produce a certain magnitude of force. Well, you can ask them to produce. We did a study, by the way, when we asked subjects to produce force unless they commanded stop. And when they told stop without any visual feedback, we ask them now keep it. And they drift. They drift as if you start with visual feedback. But otherwise, I don't really understand what it means. They
imagine that you change force, but you don't change it, and they will.
Who imagine? Subject?
Yeah.
What do you mean they imagine? So you mean motor imagery?
Okay. Next time. I'm sorry.
I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Mark,
anybody else?
Yes, maybe I'll have some general question. You mentioned at some point that we don't know how to reliably measure changes in the reference point during movement.
Yeah.
But then perhaps the central nervous system for the CNS, it might not be a trivial computation at all as well.
Well, I don't think,
because who knows how to move this point in time.
Measuring, first of all, measuring as an external observer, because we cannot do invasive experiments on humans. We cannot do many things, and with animals, ask them to do anything. Like we cannot. Can happen, given what we know about the control of movement, the type of sensory signals we receive from the periphery. So these are schemes that allow to test them in an indirect way without specifically saying where in the central nervous system this happens. And I really don't know. I mean, I can hand wave and suggest that it happens, I don't know, in a cortical somatosensory area or whatnot. But that's, or in the cerebellum. Everybody put everything into the cerebellum, so that stuff into the cerebellum as well. But it's not very productive. So currently, unfortunately, this I sometimes call motor control physics of unobservables. With physical, actually observe, we don't have measuring devices for many of the salient variables. We have measuring devices for mechanics, more or less for muscle activation, which are crude relatively, but nevertheless, better than nothing. Something for the brain, but again, now we're talking about very crude devices and nothing else. So, yeah, so we have to invent hypotheses, make behavioral predictions or macro predictions from them that can be tested by measuring things that we can measure and test them.
Issue.
Okay. Can I add something to this discussion?
Try.
Okay.
Na verdade, ainda estou transmitindo. Agora está na parte das perguntas.
Part of equilibrium point hypothesis.
Eu estou controlando. Mas meio controlando, eu estou transmitindo pelo meu canal do YouTube também.
parameter emerge at the level of single motor neurons. So if you have attention feedback length dependent,
Hoje eu vim com uma... Os outros dias eu nem vim, mas hoje eu vim com uma blusa.
when independent signal to motor neuron shift lambda, okay? Okay? So there is no problem.
Eu nem sei quanto que tá agora a temperatura.
Let's take...
So Yuri is asking a slightly different question. Yuri is asking question, it's how the, I mean, what the lambda is at the level of motor neurons, yes.
But, okay, how, if you talk about measurement of reference body configuration and where it emerged, in principle, you can respond to this question based on analogy
quem tá terminando a palestra agora é o Mark Latash, né? Aí o Mark Latash, ele falou uma coisa que eu achei interessante aqui.
Que assim, que
eles fizeram no final eles estão fazendo, mostrou alguns experimentos onde a pessoa tinha que fazer força com os dedos da mão, num certo valor de força. E aí, dois dedos. Ela tinha duas tarefas. Ela tinha uma tarefa de dizer qual era a força que ela estava fazendo. Porque é um equipamento que eles chamaram de piano invertido, que as teclas fazem força nos seus dedos. E aí você tem que manter... Sim, e aí eles têm que manter, né, a posição da tecla. E aí, aí na outra mão ele tinha que pressionar para fazer a mesma força. Aí ele falou que assim, que a percepção para agir não é a mesma percepção para contar. Então, a força que eles falavam que eles estavam fazendo nos dedos da mão direita era X, mas a força que eles faziam na mão esquerda para fazer igual, porque ele falou assim, ó, faz agora a força igual, sem feedback visual, era diferente. Então, assim, uma das coisas que ele estava comentando é que a percepção para agir e a percepção para falar é diferente.
It's just saying that with some accuracy at some phase they coincide.
Então eu achei uma coisa, interessante.
I exactly want to say what
alternou isso com a dominância.
Of course, this sufficient for
aí eu perguntei uma coisa para ele, mas ele falou que não sabe, porque isso varia muito. Sim, por exemplo, dentro do processo da gente aprender, uma das coisas que a gente teria a tendência de fazer a convergência, né, é o que a gente percebe e fala é o que a gente percebe e faz. Ele falou que, em princípio, o que a gente percebe e fala, né, o que a gente percebe e relata, e o que a gente percebe e faz não são iguais.
Practically in detail how reference position of the arm changed during pointing.
Sim, já tá, na verdade está transmitindo no YouTube.
Movement with reversal direction at each point, and you get very detailed representation how.
Eu esqueci de mandar um e-mail para o pessoal. Desculpa, é a Sofia que me perguntou, né? Porque eu esqueci de avisar, porque eu tinha falado na aula passada. Né, que a aula ia começar às 3, mas aí ontem eu pensei, eu preciso mandar um e-mail para o pessoal para lembrar que a aula vai começar às 3. Começa às 2, e aí eu esqueci.
I'm afraid that you will just get
eu vi que a Tati entrou na sala e a Sofia me mandou mensagem pelo Instagram.
No.
Daí eu falei, ups.
Reverse at any point during
But that's a completely different control.
Mas daí a Sofia falou que o pessoal reparou que no meu canal do YouTube estava transmitindo uma outra coisa, então eles lembraram, sacaram que a aula ia começar mais tarde, né? Foi isso, né, Sofia?
processes. Well, I think I understand what you are trying to say, but I think still it would be nice to have devices that allow measuring these things, because that would really open the field for much more specific studies rather than qualitative studies.
Hoje quem vai conversar conosco, né, vai ser a Juliana, né? A Ju vai falar sobre biomecânica e musculação dos membros inferiores. Né? Ela já deu essa aula de forma presencial uma vez. Antes, foi no ano antes da pandemia, né? Foi antes da pandemia. Boa tarde, Robson.
Okay.
2.
All right. Any other words of wisdom, comments?
I don't know whether it's wisdom, but I can ask a question.
Sure.
Sim, isso é verdade. Isso é uma coisa que a gente é complicado ainda de ajustar, né? As interações. É complicado.
I wish I could speak in similar English. Okay, but I would like to notice that the two minimization principle associated with referent control at the level of motor neurons and at level of multi-degree of freedom. So one principle is you nicely explained that difference between actual muscle and lambda should be positive.
Vamos adicionar só mais 2 minutos.
We are lazy. And,
a Juliana fez, ela fez a EFE, só que a gente fez, você fez esporte. A Juliana fez o bacharelado em esporte. Depois ela fez o mestrado lá na EFE, lá no laboratório de biomecânica com Júlio. E agora ela está matriculada no doutorado comigo. Né? Vai fazer o doutorado dela na medicina. Aliás, sabia? Eu entrei na CCP da fisiopatologia. Eu estou na comissão de pó. Agora eu estou como suplente, né? Eu entrei como suplente, porque teve a eleição da nova coordenação, né? São 3 membros. Não, mas mais é porque eu quero a minha vontade é me aproximar mais das coisas lá na medicina também, né? Então, se você quer aproximar, você tem que mostrar que você quer se aproximar, né? Então, acho que isso é bem legal, acho que é bem importante. A gente estava, por exemplo, a gente está tentando abrir um espaço de atividades de extensão lá no HU também. Pena que agora com essa coisa da pandemia atrapalhou tudo. A gente estava... Não tem.
So my question is, say,
aqui, eu estava assim, agora o pessoal sabe, quem está olhando no meu canal do YouTube está transmitindo uma outra coisa, né? Mas daqui a pouco vai acabar e a gente começa a transmitir a minha aula. Mas o Mark Latash estava fazendo referência a um artigo que ele publicou com o Feldman em 82.
Well, I introduced this. I don't have to. I introduced this concept
o artigo do doutorado dele, né, começou a ideia da hipótese do ponto de equilíbrio de 66.
I like his scheme of control.
Ele participa do seminário e ele pergunta, ele fica perguntando as coisas direto.
Explains well, it has space
tá comemorando
for different effects of back coupling. Those that happen within the uncontrolled manifold when perturbation leads to adjustment of other elements participating in the action in such a way that the action is mostly motor equivalent, which means that it doesn't really change the performance, but it yields
trabalha na
in
Itália,
certain
né?
directions.
E trabalha com
And the second one
professor,
is
o
more
Yuri
is
Ivanenko,
closer
né,
to
que deu,
what I was
deu a primeira
talking
palestra
about,
da escola de
is
verão.
that it's a back coupling at a higher
Esse outro
level, so
professor
at the level where the reference
trabalhou
coordinate for the
no
whole
grupo do
task is
Bernstein.
defined, which changes, and that's that is
Bernstein na
explicitly
Rússia do
in
começo.
his model.
Bernstein
So
trabalhou
I
no
use his
laboratório, trabalhou e
terminology.
fazendo
I
pesquisa
don't have any other terminology at this
até a
moment.
década de
I
60.
think I like it. So
E assim,
I cannot prove that that's how it works.
Trabalhou com ele. Né?
But on the
E
other
assim,
hand,
teve uma vez, isso é uma coisa legal, pessoal.
it's like terminology
teve
that appeals, and that comes from his scheme of control.
94. Teve um congresso foi o Motor Rehabilitation, foi um congresso de reabilitação motora. Foi em Águas de Lindóia.
If we have time.
E aí esse professor veio dar uma palestra. Eu não estou lembrando o nome dele, mas daqui a pouco eu lembro. Ele já era velhinho. Em 94 ele já era velhinho. E ele tinha, acho que ele tinha uns 60 e pouco. Ele está vivo, né? Ele está vivo e trabalha e publica. Ele tem mais de 90. Eu estava falando com o Mark Latash, né? Tava falando com o Mark. O ano que vem os Acioski comemoram 90 anos. Eu estava falando com ele da gente fazer algum evento para comemorar os 90 anos dos Acioski.
I'm sorry, one more time.
Can you comment on where the back coupling?
Mas você vê, né? Os Acioski, ele tá assistindo. O Acioski tá assistindo as palestras. Só que o computador dele é velho, não tem nem microfone nem câmera.
Different types of feedback loops that are similar to those.
Ele
We made a model,
mas ele não consegue. Aí as pessoas ficam mandando mensagem para ele.
We published it long time ago when we assumed back propagation of signals that are similar to the Renshaw cell system.
Já chegou o número suficiente, né? A Juliana, como eu estava falando, a Juliana, ela fez a graduação lá na EFE, no bacharelado em esporte. Depois ela fez o mestrado lá na EFE também com o Júlio, e agora está fazendo o doutorado comigo. E a Ju tem bastante experiência, ela também trabalha como personal trainer, né? E ela já, assim, eu já convidei ela mais de uma vez para dar aula sobre biomecânica da musculação. E ela vai hoje trabalhar com vocês, com a gente, sobre isso, né? Musculação para membros inferiores. Ju, fica à vontade para começar. Obrigado por ter aceitado o convite e estar aqui com a gente. A Juliana também trabalha bastante com a Aninha, que foi que deu a aula para a gente na semana passada.
Themselves, which that's similar to what you can expect from these very quick you can call it back coupling, you can call it physiological loops, just a combination of positive and negative physiological loops. But so these Mexican head type of excitation pictures that are very common in many structures within the central nervous system that look like something that you can expect from these Renshaw-like schemes.
Pessoal, podem perguntar, interromper na hora que vocês quiserem para a Juliana complementar o que vocês têm dúvida.
And some of them
it's probably, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's probably not one pathway or two, but I mean, it's a very complex summary kind of effect. Another example of how the system is all integrated and self-organizing. It's not just a response to.
I'm aware of quite a few studies in the neural networks area where people take real data or real connections among neurons, then they of course simplify them so that it becomes manageable. And Gregor also did a lot of that. And they produce this type of effects. They can also go from sensory signals. So this backcoupling can be within the central nervous system, then it has the advantage of short delays, but then it's less linked to the output, to the functional behavior of the animal. but it can also then be from the sensory signals in parallel, when it has direct link to the functional behavior, but the time delays may become prohibitively long, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So there are a lot of feedback loops. We can call them back coupling, we can call them just feedback loops or functional feedback effects. I don't know. I don't know which term is better. I'm kind of, I don't know. All right, so let's do the following then. So let's say goodbye to each other. It's nice seeing you all. And don't forget that next Monday we'll have Mindy's talk, same time, same place. And on Wednesday, same time, same place, we'll have the general discussion. I'm still collecting questions from participants. So if you wish certain topics to be discussed, send me your list of questions, and then I'll try. I cannot promise that all of them will be discussed because I think I already got a few dozen, and the experience suggests that each of those questions will probably take like 10-15 minutes of discussion. So we may be limited to maybe a dozen of questions or so to be covered realistically. The questions can be to specific speakers or they can be to everybody. And I hope that most of the speakers will be able to attend, and in the best case scenario, all the speakers will be able to attend. So, and so far, thank you all very much. Goodbye. See you. Have a good weekend. See you on Monday. Bye-bye.